The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison's parade ground as 300 soldiers stood in perfect formation. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves mixed with gun oil and freshly polished boots. Every uniform was immaculate, every posture rigid, every breath measured. This wasn't just any inspection, it was Judgment Day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, Lieutenant. Rose Mitchell stood in the front row, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun so tight it made her temples ache. Her dress blues were pressed to perfection, each ribbon and badge positioned with mathematical precision. She'd spent 3 hours that morning preparing, knowing that today would determine everything. The disciplinary hearing had ended 2 hours ago. Now comes the consequences. General William Hawthorne emerged from the administrative building, his weathered face carved from granite, his chest heavy with decades of ribbons and medals that caught the morning light like promises of glory. Behind him walked Colonel Patricia Sanders and Major James Morrison, their expressions unreadable masks of military discipline. The general's boots struck the concrete with the rhythm of a funeral march as he approached the formation. Rose felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face remained stone. She'd learned that skill in the mountains of Afghanistan, where showing fear meant death. Where her father had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of terror, it was standing tall despite it. The memory of Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell flickered through her mind like a candle in the wind. He'd died believing in honor, believing that the Army would protect those who served with integrity. How naive they'd both been. The general stopped. Directly in front of Rose, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of broken capillaries across his nose. His pale blue eyes, cold as January ice, bore into hers with undisguised contempt. For 30 seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic beyond the base perimeter and the whisper of wind through the oak trees that lined the parade. Ground, Lieutenant Rose Mitchell. General Hawthorne's voice carried across the formation like a crack of thunder. You have been found guilty of violating Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Dereliction of duty. Unauthorized. Disclosure of classified information to foreign nationals. Conduct unbecoming an officer. Each word hit Rose like a physical blow, but she held his gaze steadily. She knew the charges were fabricated, knew that the evidence had been planted with surgical precision. But knowledge wasn't proof, and proof was what she lacked. The USB drive they'd found in her quarters contained intelligence she'd never seen before detailed. Information about special operations missions in Syria that were so classified she didn't even have clearance to know they existed. Someone had wanted her destroyed. Someone with enough power to manufacture evidence and enough influence to ensure it would be believed. As she stared into General Hawthorne's eyes, she saw something flicker there, not just hatred, but something deeper. Something personal. The court has recommended dismissal from service and confinement for a period not exceeding 10 years. The general continued, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. However, before a sentence is carried out, you will be stripped of rank, insignia, and the privilege of wearing the uniform you have dishonored. Rose's jaw tightened imperceptibly. This wasn't standard protocol. Public humiliation wasn't part of the usual disciplinary process. This was a theater designed to break her spirit before they buried her in a military prison. She thought of her father, of the night they'd taken him away on trumped-up charges of selling weapons to insurgents. He died in custody before his trial, officially a suicide. Though the ligature marks on his neck told a different story, the pattern was too similar to be coincidence. Colonel Sanders stepped forward, her movements crisp and efficient. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like flint. Rose had always respected her, had even considered her a mentor during her early years at the academy. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. "Sergeant Davis, Sergeant Chun," Colonel Sanders called. Two MPs emerged from the formation, their faces carefully neutral. Rose recognized them both. Davis had served under her in Iraq. Chun had been her roommate at officer candidate school. The weight of their reluctance was palpable as they approached. Rose straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with defiant pride. If they wanted to humiliate her, she'd face it with dignity. She'd learned that from her father too, how to bleed without giving them the satisfaction of watching you break. Davis reached for her lieutenant's bars first, his hands trembling slightly as he removed the silver insignia from her shoulders. Chun worked on her ribbons and badges, each one representing years of service, sacrifice, and achievements that were now being erased like writing in sand. The combat infantry badge her father had helped her earn. The bronze star from her second deployment. The expert marksmanship badge she'd won by outshooting every man in her company. All of it is gone. The crowd remained silent, but Rose could feel their discomfort radiating outward like heat from a fire. Many of these soldiers had served with her and had trusted her with their lives. They knew her character, knew her dedication. This public degradation wasn't just an attack on her. It was a message to all of them about what happened to those who asked inconvenient questions. General Hawthorne watched every moment with barely concealed satisfaction. His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on anyone else's face. On his, it looked like a scar. "Now the uniform," he commanded. Rose's blood turned to ice water. This was beyond protocol, beyond regulation, beyond anything she'd ever heard of in 15 years of military service. They were going to strip her down to her undergarments in front of 300 soldiers. The humiliation would be complete. Absolute, designed to destroy not just her career, but her very sense of self. Davis hesitated, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression of profound apology. She nodded once, giving him permission to do what he had to do. Chun's hands shook as she reached for the buttons of Rose's dress blue jacket. The fabric peeled away like skin, exposing the white regulation t-shirt beneath. Rose kept her eyes fixed on a point just over General Hawthorne's left shoulder, focusing on a hawk circling high above the parade ground, free, untouchable, everything she'd never be again. The jacket hit the ground with a soft whisper of sound that seemed to echo across the silent formation. Colonel Sanders stepped forward again, her face now showing the first crack in its professional mask. Even she seemed disturbed by the extremity of this punishment. "The shirt," General Hawthorne ordered, his voice hoarse now with something that might have been anticipation. Davis and Chun exchanged a look of pure horror. In all their years of service, neither had ever been ordered to participate in something like this. It violated every principle of military justice, every concept of basic human dignity. But orders were orders, and disobedience meant court-martial. For them as well. Rose closed her eyes as she felt their hands on the hem of her t-shirt. The cool autumn air hit her skin as the fabric lifted over her head, exposing her sports bra and the pale expanse of her back to the morning sun. 300 pairs of eyes were on her, but she felt oddly detached, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. Then she heard the gasp. It started with General Hawthorne, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the silence like a blade. The sound was followed by a ripple of murmurs from the formation, soldiers craning their necks to see what had caused their commanding officer to freeze like a statue. Rose felt the sudden stillness, the electric tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. She opened her eyes to find General Hawthorne staring at her back, his face drained of all color, his pale blue eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror. The tattoo, she'd almost forgotten about it in the chaos of the past weeks. The intricate design that ran along her spine from the base of her neck to just above her tailbone. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable, the distinctive badge of the 75th Ranger Regiment's most classified unit, Delta Force. rendered in stark black ink with details so precise they could have been engraved by a master craftsman. But it wasn't just any Delta Force insignia. This one bore specific markings that only a handful of people in the entire world would recognize: unit designations, operation codes, and a small series of numbers that referred to missions so secret they didn't officially exist. Missions that had taken place in places the American public had never heard of, against enemies whose names would never appear in history books. The tattoo had been her father's idea, his way of ensuring that if something happened to him, the truth about his service wouldn't die with him. He'd insisted she get it done by a tattoo artist in Seoul who specialized in military ink, a man who'd served in Army intelligence and understood the significance of every line and curve. "That's impossible," General Hawthorne whispered, his voice barely audible. His hands were shaking now, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "That unit was disbanded. Those men are all dead." Rose turned slowly to face him, her spine straight, her shoulders squared. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The general's reaction had told her everything she needed to know. He recognized the tattoo. More than that, he was terrified of it. "Are they?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned formation. "All of them?" The general's face went from pale to gray. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around them, the soldiers began to shift restlessly, sensing that something fundamental had changed. But the balance of power had somehow tilted without warning. Colonel Sanders stepped closer to the general, her own face now showing confusion and growing alarm. "Sir, what's the significance of—" "Get her out of here," General Hawthorne interrupted, his voice cracking like ice. "Now, clear the formation." Everyone went back to the barracks. "This assembly is dismissed." But Rose didn't move. She stood there in the morning sun, half naked and defiant, watching as the man who'd tried to destroy her struggled to maintain his composure. The tattoo on her back seemed to burn with its own inner fire, each line and symbol carrying the weight of secrets that powerful men had killed to protect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You remember them now, don't you, General?" she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Operation Black Swan, the village in Kandahar. The mission that never happened, involving men who were never there." General Hawthorne's face turned ashen. His hand moved unconsciously to his sidearm, then stopped as he realized that 300 soldiers were watching his every move. Whatever secret connected him to Rose's tattoo, whatever truth he'd buried in the mountains of Afghanistan, it was clawing its way back to the surface. The formation began to break apart, as confused soldiers looked to their NCOs for guidance. But Rose remained motionless, her dark eyes locked on the general's face, reading the fear there like text on a page. She'd spent years wondering why her father had been targeted, why powerful men had wanted him silenced. Now, looking at General Hawthorne's terrified expression, she was beginning to understand. The tattoo wasn't just a memorial to her father's service. It was a confession, a detailed record of missions that certain people had claimed never existed. And someone in this chain of command had been involved in those missions, someone who'd thought all witnesses were dead and buried, someone who'd just realized that Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's daughter carried his secrets literally written on her skin. As MPs moved in to escort her away, Rose allowed herself a small, cold smile. They'd wanted to humiliate her, to break her spirit, and bury her truth. Instead, they'd exposed her back to the light of day and shown the world proof of things they'd killed to hide. The game had changed. The hunter had become the hunted, and somewhere in the shadows, she was beginning to realize her father's old unit was still watching. The concrete walls of the military detention, Facility seemed to press in around Rose as she sat on the narrow steel bench, now wearing standard issue. Orange coveralls that hung loose on her frame. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with an incessant hum that had already begun to drive her mad after just 6 hours of confinement. But her mind wasn't focused on the discomfort. It was traveling back through the years, trying to piece together how a girl from small-town Montana had ended up in a cell, branded as a traitor. Rose Jennifer Mitchell had been born in Billings on a snowy February morning in 1992, the daughter of Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell and elementary school teacher Sarah Chun Mitchell. Her earliest memories were of her father in dress greens, towering above her like a mountain of discipline and quiet strength. He'd taught her to march before she could properly walk, to salute before she could tie her shoes. Military life wasn't just their profession, it was their religion. The Mitchell family moved 17 times during Rose's childhood, following Thomas's assignments from base to base across the continental United States and overseas. While other children struggled with the constant upheaval, Rose had thrived on it. Each new post was an adventure, each new school a challenge to conquer. She'd learned to adapt, to read people quickly, to make friends fast and leave without. Looking back when the orders came through by age 10, she could field strip an M16 blindfolded. By 12, she was out shooting seasoned soldiers at the base gun range. Her father had been proud but careful, never pushing too hard, always reminding her that strength without wisdom was just brutality. "The military makes you tough," he'd told her during their last conversation at Fort Bragg, "but it's your heart that makes you a soldier worth following." High school had been a blur of academic excellence and athletic achievement. Rose had been valedictorian at 3 different schools as her family moved, captain of the debate team, varsity track star, and president of the student council. Her guidance counselors pushed her toward Harvard and Princeton, speaking excitedly about full scholarships and bright futures in law or medicine. But Rose had never wavered from her chosen path. West Point had been the only application she'd submitted. The United States Military Academy had shaped her into something harder, sharper, more focused than she'd ever imagined possible. 4 years of engineering classes, leadership training, and military science had stripped away every weakness and polished every strength until she gleamed like a blade fresh from the forge. Her classmates had called her Iron Rose, beautiful but untouchable, perfect but somehow unreachable. She'd graduated second in her class, behind only Marcus Webb, a farm boy from Iowa whose genius for logistics had made him legendary among the faculty. Rose had been fine with second place. Being first made you a target, and her father had taught her early that sometimes the smartest move was to let someone else take the spotlight, while you positioned yourself for the real victory. Her first assignment had been to the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she'd served as a platoon leader in the division's most demanding unit. The men under her command had been skeptical at first. A young female officer fresh from the academy wasn't exactly what they'd been hoping for. But Rose had earned their respect the hard way, through months of pre-dawn runs in full gear, flawless navigation exercises, and the kind of quiet competence that spoke louder than any speech. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez had been her first real test. A 20-year veteran with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of ribbons, he'd made it clear from day one that he didn't think women belonged in combat units. Rose had handled him with surgical precision, not through confrontation, but through consistent excellence. She'd outperformed him in every training exercise, outhought him in every tactical scenario, and outlasted him in every endurance test until he'd grudgingly admitted that maybe she belonged after all. "You're not like the others," he'd told her after a particularly brutal field exercise in the Tennessee mountains. "Most officers, they try to prove they're tough by being cruel. You just show us what tough looks like and let us decide for ourselves." The respect of men like Rodriguez had meant everything to Rose. It validated every sacrifice, every painful mile run in the darkness before dawn, every decision to choose duty over personal happiness. When her college friends were getting married and starting families, Rose was learning to lead soldiers in environments where a single mistake could mean death for everyone under her command. Her first deployment to Iraq had come in 2015, just as the political situation was beginning to stabilize, but the security threats remained complex and deadly. Rose had been assigned to a joint task force responsible for training Iraqi army units in counterinsurgency tactics. It was delicate work, requiring not just military skill but cultural sensitivity and diplomatic finesse. She'd thrown herself into learning Arabic, spending her off-duty hours with Iraqi officers and their families, building the kind of relationships that made real cooperation possible. While other American officers maintained strict professional distance, Rose had attended weddings, shared meals, and listened to stories of families torn apart by decades of war. She'd understood instinctively that winning hearts and minds wasn't just a slogan, it was the difference between success and failure in a counterinsurgency campaign. The breakthrough had come during her 8th month in country, when intelligence reports indicated a major insurgent attack planned against the Iraqi army base where Rose's team was stationed. Most of the American advisors had wanted to call in additional security and hunker down behind their fortified compound. Rose had taken a different approach, working with Captain Halil al-Rashid, the Iraqi officer she'd grown closest to. Rose had developed a plan to turn the insurgents' attack into a trap. Instead of reinforcing their defenses, they'd created the appearance of vulnerability while secretly repositioning their strongest units for a counterattack. The insurgents had walked into an ambush that decimated their forces and captured their leader, a high-value target who'd been evading coalition forces for months. The success had earned Rose a Bronze Star and recognition from the Iraqi government. More importantly, it had established her reputation as an officer who could think outside conventional parameters and deliver results in impossible situations. When she'd returned to Fort Campbell after her deployment, she'd found herself being recruited for increasingly specialized assignments. The second deployment had been different entirely. Afghanistan, 2017. Embedded with Special Operations Forces conducting raids against high-value targets in the mountains along the Pakistani border. Rose had been selected not for her combat skills, impressive as they were, but for her ability to process complex intelligence and make split-second tactical decisions under extreme pressure. She'd worked with operators whose names she'd never learned, men who moved through the Hindu Kush like ghosts and struck with the precision of surgical instruments. They'd conducted 17 successful raids during her 6-month rotation, capturing or killing some of the most wanted terrorists in South Asia. Rose had proven herself in firefights at altitudes where the thin air made every breath a struggle, in conditions where the margin for error was measured in fractions of seconds. It was during that deployment that she'd first heard whispers about her father's final mission. Late-night conversations around secure communications equipment, fragments of stories about a unit that had supposedly been disbanded years earlier. The men she worked with spoke of Thomas Mitchell with a respect that bordered on reverence, referring to operations that didn't appear in any official record. "Your old man was legend," Master Sergeant Kevin Patterson had told her one night as they waited for extraction after a particularly harrowing raid. Some of the stuff he pulled off in the early days of the war. Let's just say there's a reason certain bad guys stopped sleeping soundly at night. But when Rose had pressed for details, Patterson had clammed up, claiming he'd already said too much. It was a pattern she'd encountered repeatedly. Veterans who'd known her father would start to tell stories, then suddenly remember classification levels and change the subject. The more she'd pushed, the more walls she'd encountered. After Afghanistan, Rose had been assigned to the Pentagon, working in the intelligence division that coordinated special operations across multiple theaters. It should have been a career-making assignment, putting her in position for rapid promotion and increased responsibility. Instead, it had become a nightmare of bureaucratic warfare and hidden agendas. Her supervisor, Colonel Janet Morrison, had been supportive initially, praising Rose's analytical skills and recommending her for advanced intelligence training. But something had changed after Rose had begun asking questions about historical special operations missions, particularly those involving units that had been officially disbanded or had never officially existed. The first warning had been subtle: a poor performance review that criticized Rose's tendency to pursue tangential research beyond the scope of assigned duties. When she'd continued investigating, the warnings had become more direct. Morrison had called her into a private meeting and suggested that some questions were better left unasked, that successful intelligence officers learn to focus on current threats rather than historical curiosities. Rose had backed off temporarily, but the patterns she'd uncovered were too significant to ignore. Financial records that didn't match operational reports. Personnel files that had been heavily redacted or had disappeared entirely. References to missions that appeared in some documents but were completely absent from others. It painted a picture of a systematic cover-up involving operations that had gone far beyond anything officially acknowledged. When she'd finally found a paper trail connecting her father's unit to a series of operations in Afghanistan that had resulted in massive weapon seizures, Rose had realized she was looking at something much larger than simple classification issues. The weapons hadn't been destroyed or turned over to Afghan authorities. They'd been redirected through channels that led back to American defense contractors. Someone had been using covert operations as a cover for arms trafficking on a massive scale. That was when the surveillance had started. Unmarked cars following her home from work. Her apartment was searched while she was on duty, with items moved just enough to let her know someone had been there. Phone calls that ended when she answered. Emails that disappeared from her server without explanation. Rose had documented everything, creating encrypted files and backup copies stored in multiple locations. She'd been preparing to take her evidence to the Inspector General when the raid on her quarters had uncovered the planted USB drive. The timing had been perfect, the evidence damning, the case against her airtight. As she sat in her cell, Rose realized that her entire career had been building toward this moment. Every success, every commendation, every sign of distinction had made her a more valuable target when the time came to silence her. They'd let her rise high enough to give her access to the information they needed to suppress, then destroy her credibility so thoroughly that no one would believe her accusations. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that Thomas, Mitchell's daughter, would break under pressure, that the humiliation and isolation would crush her spirit and make her desperate to accept whatever deal they offered. They'd underestimated the steel core that 15 years of military service had forged inside her, the unwavering sense of duty that made surrender impossible. More importantly, they'd revealed their own connection to the conspiracy by recognizing the tattoo on her back. General Hawthorne's reaction had told her everything she needed to know about who was involved and how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. As the afternoon wore on and shadows lengthened across her cell floor, Rose began to smile for the first time in weeks. They'd tried to bury her, but they'd made the mistake of showing their hand too early. The perfect soldier they'd created was about to become their perfect enemy. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her cell, she was beginning to sense that her father's legacy included more than just a tattoo and a handful of classified memories. The men of his unit might have been declared dead, but Rose was starting to suspect that reports of their demise had been greatly exaggerated. The conspiracy against Rose Mitchell had been 2 years in the making, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign and the ruthlessness of a corporate takeover. What she couldn't have known as she sat in her detention cell was that her destruction had been planned from the moment she'd been assigned to the Pentagon's Special Operations Intelligence Division. The meeting that sealed her fate had taken place in a private dining room at the Pond. The Army-Navy Club in downtown Washington, D.C. On a rain-soaked evening in October 2021, 5 men sat around a mahogany table that had witnessed similar conversations for over a century, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of crystal chandeliers that had hung there since before the First World War. General William Hawthorne occupied the head of the table, his dress uniform impeccable despite the late hour. To his right sat Marcus Ventresses, a defense contractor whose company, Ventresses Strategic Solutions, had earned over $3 billion in government contracts during the past decade. Across from Ventresses, Colonel Patricia Sanders nursed a brandy and tried to ignore the growing knot of unease in her stomach. The fourth man at the table was Congressman Bradley Hutchinson, chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Intelligence and Special Operations. His political career had been built on a foundation of unwavering support for military spending and an almost religious devotion to national security. The fifth participant joined them via secure video link from Langley Deputy Director Harrison Vale of the Central Intelligence Agency, his angular face rendered ghostly by the blue glow of the monitor. "Gentlemen," General Hawthorne began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform, "we have a problem. Lieutenant Mitchell has been asking questions about Operation Black Swan." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of traffic on Massachusetts Avenue and the gentle hiss of rain against the windows. Operation Black Swan was supposed to be buried so deep that even its name had been scrubbed from official records. The fact that Thomas Mitchell's daughter was digging into it represented a threat that none of them could afford to ignore. Marcus Ventresses leaned forward, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood. "How much does she know?" "Too much," Hawthorne replied grimly. "She's accessed financial records, personnel files, even some of the original mission reports. Her security clearance gives her access to archives that most people can't even find." Congressman Hutchinson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Remind me why we didn't transfer her to a different assignment when she first started poking around." "Because transfers create paper trails." Deputy Director Vale's voice crackled through the speakers. "Moving her would have raised questions we don't want answered. Better to handle this internally." Colonel Sanders finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Lieutenant Mitchell is an exemplary officer. Her record is spotless, her performance exceptional. If we move against her without just cause can be manufactured," Ventresses interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. "It's been done before." Sanders felt her blood turn cold. She'd known these men for years, had served alongside some of them, but in this moment, they felt like strangers. "You're talking about destroying an innocent woman's career." "We're talking about protecting national security," General Hawthorne corrected, "and preserving the lives and reputations of the men who served this country with distinction during some of our darkest hours." The general's words carried weight, because everyone at the table knew what Operation Black Swan had really been. Officially, it had never existed. Unofficially, it had been a joint CIA Special Forces operation designed to destabilize arms trafficking networks in Afghanistan by capturing their weapons and redirecting them to friendly militias fighting the Taliban. What had started as a legitimate counter-terrorism operation had gradually evolved into something far more lucrative. When the friendly militias proved unreliable and the captured weapons continued to pile up in secure warehouses, someone had suggested a different approach. Why not sell the weapons to private military contractors who could put them to better use in other theaters of operation? The logic had been seductive. The weapons were already off the books. Their original owners were dead or scattered, and the profits could fund additional black operations without requiring congressional approval. It was a perfect solution that served American interests while generating revenue for future missions. Thomas Mitchell had been the operations logistics coordinator, responsible for cataloging captured weapons and arranging their transport too. secure facilities. He'd been chosen for his expertise in supply chain management and his reputation for absolute reliability. What his superiors hadn't anticipated was his moral flexibility, or rather, his lack thereof. When Staff Sergeant Mitchell had discovered that weapons intended for friendly forces were being diverted to private contractors and sold on the international market, he'd done exactly what his training had taught him to do. He'd reported it through proper channels, filing detailed reports with his chain of command and requesting clarification on the operation's objectives. The response had been swift and decisive. Thomas Mitchell was reassigned to a different unit. His security clearance was downgraded, and his access to Operation Black Swan was terminated. When he'd persisted in asking questions, he'd been transferred to a remote outpost in Kandahar province, as far from the operations headquarters as possible, while still keeping him within the theater of operations. That should have been the end of it. Thomas Mitchell should have completed his tour, returned to the United States, and forgotten about Operation Black Swan like a good soldier. Instead, he'd continued his investigation from his new assignment, using his contacts throughout the special operations community to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. The evidence he'd compiled was devastating. Financial records showing payments from Ventress's Strategic Solutions to shell companies controlled by CIA front organizations. Personnel files documenting the assignment of Special Forces operators to missions that officially didn't exist. Communications. Intercepts proving that weapons captured during legitimate operations were being sold to the highest bidder regardless of their political affiliations. Thomas Mitchell had been preparing to take his evidence to Congress when fate intervened in the form of an improvised explosive device on a mountain road outside Kandahar. The official report blamed Taliban insurgents for the attack that killed him and 2 other soldiers. The unofficial truth was more complicated. The father was a problem, General Hawthorne continued, his voice devoid of emotion. But he's been handled. The daughter represents a new threat, one that requires a different approach. Deputy Director Vale's image flickered on the monitor as he adjusted his position. What do you propose? Lieutenant Mitchell will be charged with unauthorized disclosure of classified information, Hawthorne explained. The evidence will be planted in her quarters during a routine security inspection. Her court-martial will be swift and decisive. Marcus Ventress smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd seen similar problems solved before. What about the evidence she's already compiled, her files, her research? Her security clearance will be revoked the moment she's arrested, Colonel Sanders said reluctantly. She'll lose access to all classified systems, and her personal files will be confiscated as evidence. And if she's already made copies? Congressman Hutchinson asked. Then we'll find them, Ventress replied. My company has excellent relationships with several private security firms who specialize in information recovery. Very thorough, very discreet. The meeting had continued for another hour, working out the details of Rose's destruction with the methodical precision of a bombing mission. They'd identified the USB drive that would be planted in her quarters, a device containing intelligence so sensitive that its mere possession would be grounds for treason charges. They'd selected the timing of the raid to coincide with her duty schedule, ensuring she'd be on base when the evidence was discovered. They'd even chosen the specific charges that would be filed, crafting a narrative that would destroy her credibility while protecting their own interests. Colonel Sanders had been assigned the task of overseeing the investigation, a role that made her physically ill, but which she'd accepted in the name of damage control. At least if she was involved, she could ensure that Lieutenant Mitchell received fair treatment within the bounds of what was possible. The plan had been implemented with military efficiency. The USB drive was planted during a night shift when Rose was working late in the intelligence center. The raid was conducted by MPs who had no knowledge of the conspiracy, their orders coming through legitimate channels that made the operation appear routine. Even the evidence itself had been carefully crafted, containing real intelligence that Rose could theoretically have accessed, making her guilt appear plausible to anyone who investigated. But General Hawthorne had insisted on one additional element. That went beyond mere prosecution. The public humiliation, the stripping of her uniform in front of the entire formation, was designed to break Rose's spirit so completely that she'd never recover enough to pose a future threat. It was a psychological warfare technique that the general had learned during his own special operations career, a way of destroying an enemy's will to fight by attacking their sense of identity and self-worth. The plan had been perfect in every detail except one. None of the conspirators had known about the tattoo on Rose's back, the detailed record of her father's service that she carried literally written on her skin. They'd assumed that Thomas Mitchell had been a standard Special Forces operative, unaware of his role in Operation Black Swan or his knowledge of their activities. When General Hawthorne had seen those specific unit designations and operation codes rendered in stark black ink, he'd realized that their carefully constructed cover story was built on a foundation of lies. Thomas Mitchell hadn't been a peripheral figure in Operation Black Swan. He'd been at its very center, with access to information that could destroy careers and send powerful men to prison. The tattoo represented more than just a memorial to her father's service. It was a roadmap to the conspiracy, a detailed guide to the operations and personnel involved in one of the most classified missions in recent military history. Every symbol, every number, every carefully rendered detail was a breadcrumb that could lead investigators back to the truth. They'd killed to suppress. As news of the morning's events spread through Fort Harrison's rumor mill, emergency meetings were being called in Washington, D.C. Secure phone lines crackled with urgent conversations. As the conspirators tried to assess the damage and develop a response strategy, the careful plan they'd spent 2 years developing was unraveling in real time, and they had no contingency for the possibility that their victim might possess evidence they'd never known existed. Marcus Ventris was the first to grasp the full implications of what had happened. "If that tattoo contains what I think it does," he told General Hawthorne during a scrambled phone call, "then we're not just dealing with a security breach. We're looking at potential exposure of the entire operation." "How many people saw it?" Deputy Director Vale demanded during an emergency conference call. 300 soldiers, Colonel Sanders replied, her voice hollow with despair. "Maybe more if word spreads to other units." The realization that their perfect plan had backfired so spectacularly sent shockwaves through the conspiracy. They'd intended to destroy Rose Mitchell's credibility and bury her accusations under an avalanche of criminal charges. Instead, they'd provided her with a public platform to display evidence they'd never known existed, evidence that corroborated every accusation she might make. "We need to accelerate the timeline," General Hawthorne decided. "The court-martial proceedings begin immediately. We get her convicted and sentenced before she has time to explain what that tattoo means." But even as they scrambled to contain the damage, the conspirators were beginning to realize that they'd made a fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that Thomas Mitchell had been working alone when he'd compiled his evidence against Operation Black Swan. They'd believed that his death had ended the threat, and that his daughter's investigation was nothing more than the amateur efforts of a grieving child trying to clear her father's name. The tattoo suggested a different possibility entirely. If Thomas Mitchell had been prescient enough to encode operational details in a permanent record on his daughter's skin, what other preparations might he have made? What other insurance policies might he have put in place to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't? As Rose sat in her detention cell, unaware of the panic her tattoo had triggered, the men who'd destroyed her life were beginning to understand that they'd awakened to something far more dangerous than a single angry officer seeking justice for her father's death. They'd potentially triggered the activation of a plan that had been decades in the making, a dead man switch that could bring down everyone involved in Operation Black Swan. The perfect betrayal was about to become a perfect disaster. And the hunter was rapidly becoming the hunted. The first clue came in the form of a maintenance worker who shouldn't have existed. Rose had been in solitary confinement for 36 hours when she heard the soft scraping sound outside her cell. The military detention facility at Fort Harrison operated on rigid schedules, meals at predetermined times, guard rotations every 4 hours, maintenance checks logged and documented. But it was 2:47 a.m., well outside any authorized maintenance window, and the sound was too deliberate to be random. She moved silently to the small window in her cell door, pressing her eye to the reinforced glass. A man in standard maintenance coveralls was working on the electrical panel that controlled the lighting for her corridor. He was tall and lean, with graying hair visible beneath his cap and hands that moved with the precision of someone who'd performed this task countless times before. What made Rose's blood freeze was the tattoo she glimpsed on his forearm as he reached up to adjust a circuit breaker. Even in the dim light, she could make out the distinctive design, a wolf's head surrounded by lightning bolts, the unofficial symbol of her father's unit that had supposedly been disbanded. 15 years ago, the man worked for exactly 7 minutes, then packed his tools and disappeared down the corridor without a sound. 10 minutes later, Rose discovered what he'd done. The fluorescent light in her cell began to flicker in a pattern that wasn't random 3 short pulses. 3 long, 3 short again. Morse code. SOS. But it wasn't a distress signal. It was an identification code, one her father had taught her during their camping trips in the Montana wilderness when she was 12 years old. Each member of his unit had a unique signature, a way of identifying themselves to family members if traditional communication channels were compromised. This particular code belonged to Master Sergeant Daniel Krajewski, her father's second-in-command. During Operation Black Swan, according to official records, Krajewski had died in a helicopter crash in Pakistan in 2009, apparently. Those records were as fictional as everything else surrounding her father's unit. Rose spent the rest of the night staring at that flickering light, her mind racing through the implications. If Krajewski was alive, if he was here at Fort Harrison, then her father's contingency plans went far deeper than she'd ever imagined. The tattoo on her back wasn't just a memorial, it was an activation signal, a way of identifying herself to surviving members of a unit that the world believed was dead. The next morning brought a new development that confirmed her suspicions. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the military defense attorney assigned to her case, arrived for their first meeting carrying a briefcase that seemed unremarkable except for one small detail. Scratched into the leather near the handle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was a tiny symbol that made Rose's heart skip a beat. It was the same wolf's head she'd seen on the maintenance worker's arm, rendered in miniature but unmistakable to anyone who knew its significance. Captain Walsh was either a member of her father's network or someone they'd recruited to help with Rose's defense. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Captain Walsh began, her voice professionally neutral as she activated a small electronic device that would prevent their conversation from being monitored. "I've reviewed the charges against you, and I have to say, the evidence is quite compelling." Rose studied the woman across from her, noting the way she held herself with the controlled tension of someone accustomed to danger. Walsh was younger than Rose had expected, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings. "Compelling but fabricated," Rose replied carefully, unsure how much she could trust this stranger despite the symbol on her briefcase. Walsh nodded almost imperceptibly. "That's what we're going to prove. But first, I need to understand exactly what you know about your father's final assignment." The question was loaded with meaning that went far beyond normal attorney-client discussions. Rose realized that this conversation wasn't really about her legal defense. It was about determining how much she'd learned about Operation Black Swan and whether she could be trusted with information that had gotten her father killed. I know that he died because he discovered something he wasn't supposed to see, Rose said slowly. I know that powerful people wanted him silenced, and I know that the same people are trying to destroy me for asking questions. Captain Walsh leaned forward, slightly, her green eyes intense. What else? Rose made a decision that would change everything. Lifting her shirt, she turned to show Walsh the tattoo that had caused such a dramatic reaction during her humiliation ceremony. She heard the sharp intake of breath, followed by a whispered curse that told her everything she needed to know. Jesus Christ, Walsh breathed. He actually did it. Tom said he was going to create an insurance policy, but we never imagined. The mask of professional distance fell away, revealing someone who'd known Thomas Mitchell personally and had been waiting 15 years for this moment. Rose turned back around, studying Walsh's face for any sign of deception. You served with him, Rose said. It wasn't a question. Military intelligence, attached to his unit during the final phase of Operation Black Swan, Walsh confirmed. I was a lieutenant then, fresh out of the Defense Language Institute with a specialty in Dari and Pashto. Your father saved my life. 3 times in 6 months. The revelation opened floodgates of information that had been building pressure for over a decade. Captain Walsh, whose real name was Jennifer Volkov, daughter of a Russian emigrant who'd chosen her cover identity carefully, had been one of the few people who'd known about Thomas Mitchell's investigation into the weapons trafficking conspiracy. Your father was methodical, Volkov explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper despite the electronic countermeasures. He didn't just collect evidence, he created multiple redundancies, backup plans within backup plans. The tattoo was his masterpiece. She produced a small tablet computer from her briefcase, its screen showing what appeared to be architectural blueprints. But as Rose studied the images more carefully, she realized they weren't building plans. They were maps of the tattoo on her back, with each symbol and design element labeled and explained. Every line contains information, Volkov continued, her finger tracing patterns on the screen that corresponded to marks on Rose's spine. Unit designations, operation codes, financial account numbers, even GPS coordinates. Your father essentially turned your back into a classified document that could only be read by people who knew what they were looking for. The Delta Force insignia that formed the tattoo's centerpiece contained the most crucial information. The unit number corresponded to a Swiss bank account where Thomas Mitchell had deposited copies of his evidence. The operation codes spelled out a sequence that would unlock encrypted files hidden in servers around the world. Even the artistic flourishes that made the tattoo aesthetically pleasing contained data that could expose the entire conspiracy. He trained you for this without you even knowing it, Volkov said, her voice filled with admiration for her dead comrade's foresight. All those camping trips where he taught you survival skills, map reading, cryptography disguised as games. He was preparing you to be his backup plan. Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the detention cell. Her entire childhood had been preparation for this moment. Every lesson and skill carefully chosen to give her the tools she'd need to survive what was coming. Her father had known that asking questions about Operation Black Swan would eventually get him killed, so he'd created a living backup of everything he'd discovered. The bank account in Switzerland contains more than just financial records, Volkov continued. Your father spent 2 years collecting evidence, photographs, audio recordings, financial documents, personnel files. Everything needed to expose not just the weapons trafficking, but the entire network of corruption that made it possible. She showed Rose another screen displaying a complex organizational chart that looked like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. General Hawthorne occupied a central position, connected by lines to defense contractors, CIA operatives, congressmen, and foreign arms dealers. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking, a network that had been operating for decades, using covert operations as cover for private enrichment. But accessing that information requires more than just account numbers, Volkov warned. Your father designed the security protocols to require multiple authentication factors. The tattoo provides the first level, but there are others. She explained that Thomas Mitchell had distributed additional pieces of the puzzle among surviving members of his unit, men who'd been officially declared dead, but who'd actually been extracted and given new identities. The maintenance worker who'd visited Rose's cell was one of them. There were others scattered across the country, living quiet lives under assumed names, waiting for the signal that would bring them back into action. How many? Rose asked. 12 survivors from the original unit, Volkov replied, plus associates and family members who've been brought into the network over the years. Your father wasn't just collecting evidence. He was building an organization capable of exposing the truth and protecting the people who helped him do it. The revelation that she was part of a larger network provided Rose with the first hope she'd felt since her arrest. She wasn't alone, wasn't fighting an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. Her father had spent the last years of his life preparing for this moment, creating a support structure that could survive even if he didn't. What's the next step? Rose asked. Volkov's expression grew grim. They're going to try to move your court-martial forward as quickly as possible. General Hawthorne and his associates know that time isn't on their side. The longer you remain visible, the more chance there is that people will start asking questions about that tattoo. She explained that the original plan had been to wait until Rose's legal proceedings were complete before activating the network. But the public revelation of the tattoo had accelerated everyone's timeline. The conspiracy was already taking steps to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence, which meant the network had to act before their targets could escape. There's something else, Volkov said, her voice dropping even lower. Your father didn't just investigate Operation Black Swan. In the months before his death, he uncovered evidence of other operations, other conspiracies. The weapons trafficking was just the beginning. She showed Rose classified documents that painted a picture of systemic corruption reaching into the highest levels of government and the military-industrial complex. Defense contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper. Military operations designed not to achieve strategic objectives, but to create opportunities for private profit. Intelligence assessments manipulated to justify interventions that benefited specific corporate interests. Your father called it the Hydra Protocol, Volkov explained. A network of interlocking conspiracies designed to perpetuate conflict and funnel taxpayer money into private hands. Operation Black Swan was just one tentacle. The scope of what Thomas Mitchell had uncovered was staggering. Rose realized that her father hadn't just been investigating a single case of corruption. He'd stumbled onto a shadow system that had been operating for decades, possibly longer. The people who'd killed him weren't just trying to cover up one operation. They were protecting an entire parallel structure of power and profit. That's why they were so desperate to stop you, Volkov continued. Your investigation wasn't just threatening Operation Black Swan, it was threatening to expose the entire system. If that information becomes public... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Rose could imagine the chaos that would result from revealing the true scope of the conspiracy. Congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, the collapse of defense contractors worth billions of dollars. The people involved would do anything to prevent that outcome, including eliminating anyone who posed a threat. As their meeting concluded, Volkov provided Rose with final pieces of crucial information. The network had been monitoring her situation and preparing for multiple contingencies. If her legal defense failed, there were extraction plans in place. If she was convicted, there were ways to continue the mission from inside prison. If the worst happened, there were protocols to ensure that the truth would still come to light. Your father made one request, Volkov said as she prepared to leave. If anything happened to him, if the network was ever activated, he wanted you to know that he was proud of the person you'd become. Everything he did was to give you the choice he never had, the choice to fight back against people who think they're above the law. After Volkov left, Rose lay on her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, processing everything she'd learned. The tattoo on her back had transformed from a memorial into a weapon, a key that could unlock secrets powerful enough to bring down governments. Her father's death hadn't been the end of his mission, it had been the beginning of hers. But as she contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead, Rose realized that knowing the truth was only the first step. The real challenge would be staying alive long enough to reveal it to the world. The people who'd killed her father were already moving to eliminate her, and time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. The hidden truth was finally emerging from the shadows, but the most dangerous phase of the operation was just beginning. The activation began at precisely 3:33 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 15 years after the world had been told that Bravo Team was dead. Across 3 time zones, cell phones that hadn't received calls in over a decade suddenly buzzed to life. The messages were identical, a single photograph of a wolf's head surrounded by lightning bolts, followed by a string of numbers that corresponded. TOGPS coordinates. To anyone monitoring communications traffic, they would appear to be spam messages sent to random numbers. To the 12 men who received them, they were the signal they'd been waiting for since Thomas Mitchell's funeral. In Seattle, David Park was installing security systems for a tech company when his phone vibrated. The former demolitions expert looked at the screen, felt his world shift on its axis, and calmly informed his supervisor that he had a family emergency. 20 minutes later, he was driving east on Interstate 90 with a go bag he'd packed 15 years ago and never touched. In Phoenix, Marcus Rodriguez was teaching high school mathematics when his phone lit up during the 3rd period. The man who'd once been the unit's intelligence specialist excused himself from class, walked to his car, and began making calls to numbers he'd memorized but never used. His students would later say that Mr. Rodriguez had seemed different that day, like a switch had been flipped inside him. In Atlanta, James Patterson was working the night shift at a hospital when the message arrived. The former medic who'd saved more lives than he could count during 3 tours in Afghanistan quietly finished his rounds, submitted his resignation via email, and drove to a storage unit that contained equipment he'd hoped never to need again. Each man followed protocols they'd rehearsed in their minds countless times. They cleared their financial accounts, activated predetermined cover stories, and began converging on rally points established over a decade ago. They were ghosts returning to life, shadows stepping back into the light, dead men walking toward a reckoning 15 years in the making. The first to reach Fort Harrison was Master Sergeant Daniel Kraski, who'd been living as a maintenance contractor in nearby Billings. He'd spent the previous 3 days conducting reconnaissance, mapping guard rotations, and identifying security vulnerabilities. The military detention facility where Rose was being held operated unpredictable schedules, but breaking her out would require precision timing and intimate knowledge of the base's layout. Krajewski met with Jennifer Volkov in a diner 20 miles from the base, their conversation disguised as a routine business meeting. To any casual observer, they were a contractor and a lawyer discussing security upgrades for the legal offices. In reality, they were finalizing plans for an operation that would either expose the truth about Operation Black Swan or get them all killed. "How many are coming?" Volkov asked, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't intend to drink. "All of them," Krajewski replied, his weathered face showing the strain of 15 years in hiding. "Patterson's bringing medical supplies. Rodriguez has the financial access codes. Even Thompson is coming, and his injuries from that last mission should have kept him in a wheelchair for life." The reunion of Thomas Mitchell's unit was more than just a military operation. It was a resurrection of bonds forged in combat and strengthened by shared sacrifice. These men had been brothers before they'd been declared dead, and the years of separation hadn't diminished their loyalty to each other or their commitment to their fallen leader's mission. But they weren't working alone. The network Thomas Mitchell had built extended far beyond his original unit, encompassing family members, former intelligence operatives, and carefully vetted civilians who'd been brought into the conspiracy over the years. Sarah Chun Mitchell, Rose's mother, had been part of the network from the beginning, her background in education providing perfect cover for her role as a communications coordinator. Dr. Alana Vasquez, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracking illegal financial transactions, had spent 10 years following the money trails that connected Operation Black Swan to dozens of other suspicious activities. Her analysis had revealed the true scope of the Hydra Protocol, a web of corruption that extended into defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and congressional oversight committees. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, officially retired from the Army but unofficially still connected to various intelligence networks, had been monitoring communications traffic and personnel movements around Fort Harrison. His sources within the Pentagon had confirmed that General Hawthorne was accelerating Rose's court-martial proceedings, trying to convict and sentence her before the truth about her tattoo could spread. The network had grown organically over the years, attracting people who'd encountered various aspects of the conspiracy in their professional lives. A FBI forensic analyst who'd noticed patterns in weapon seizures that didn't match official reports. A congressional aide who discovered budget discrepancies that pointed to unauthorized operations. A journalist who'd been investigating defense contractor fraud and stumbled onto connections she wasn't supposed to find. Each new recruit brought additional skills and resources, but also increased the risk of exposure. The larger the network grew, the more difficult it became to maintain operational security. Thomas Mitchell had understood this paradox and built multiple fail-safes into his organization, compartmentalizing information so that no single person, except Rose herself, could compromise the entire operation. The activation of the network created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate mission to expose Operation Black Swan. For 15 years, these people had been living double lives, maintaining their cover identities while secretly documenting evidence of systematic corruption. Now that the network was active, that evidence was beginning to surface in carefully coordinated releases. Financial records appeared on the desks of investigative journalists. Classified documents were leaked to congressional staffers. Forensic evidence was anonymously submitted to federal prosecutors. The conspiracy that had operated in shadows for decades suddenly found itself under a spotlight that grew brighter with each passing hour. General Hawthorne and his associates recognized the threat immediately. Emergency meetings were called. Secure communications were activated, and contingency plans that had been developed for exactly this scenario were put into motion. But they'd made a critical error in their assumptions about Thomas Mitchell's network. They believed that the evidence collected about Operation Black Swan was static, a finite collection of documents and recordings that could be contained or destroyed. They hadn't realized that the network had been actively gathering intelligence for 15 years, continuously updating and expanding their documentation of the conspiracy's activities. Every phone call between the conspirators was monitored. Every financial transaction was tracked. Every attempt to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses was documented and preserved. The network had evolved from a passive repository of historical information into an active intelligence gathering operation that knew more about the conspiracy than the conspirators knew about themselves. Marcus Ventresses discovered this reality when his supposedly secure communications with General Hawthorne were transcribed and delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission within hours of being transmitted. The conversation, which included detailed discussions of bribing foreign officials and manipulating defense contracts, was enough to trigger immediate federal investigations into his company's activities. Congressman Bradley Hutchinson learned about the network's capabilities when classified documents from his private files appeared in a Washington Post story about congressional oversight failures. The documents proved that he'd been briefed on irregularities in Operation Black Swan and had actively worked to suppress investigations that might have exposed the truth. Deputy Director Harrison Vale found himself under scrutiny when financial records showing payments from CIA front companies to private contractors appeared in the New York Times. The payments correlated exactly with the timeline of Operation Black Swan, providing documentary proof of the agency's involvement in what was supposed to be a purely military operation. The coordinated release of information created a crisis that reached the highest levels of government. Congressional leaders demanded immediate investigations. The Attorney General ordered federal prosecutors to review all cases involving the named individuals. The President was briefed on the situation and authorized the use of military intelligence resources to determine the scope of the conspiracy. But the most significant development was the response from within the military itself. Officers who'd served with Thomas Mitchell began coming forward with their own stories of suspicious activities and covered-up operations. The dam of silence that had protected the conspiracy for decades was beginning to crack, and water was seeping through at an accelerating rate. Rose became aware of these developments through carefully coded messages from Jennifer Volkov during their legal consultations. The knowledge that her father's network was finally active, that 15 years of preparation were coming to fruition, filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. She understood that she was no longer just fighting for her own freedom. She'd become the symbol around which an entire resistance movement was organizing. The tattoo on her back had served its purpose as an activation signal, but now it represented something even more powerful. It was proof that the military's own personnel had been systematically betrayed by their leaders, that soldiers had died not in service of their country, but to protect the profits of defense contractors and corrupt officials. As word of the tattoo's significance spread through the military community, Rose began receiving messages of support from unexpected sources. Officers who'd never met her sent coded expressions of solidarity. Enlisted personnel found ways to convey their belief in her innocence. Even some of the guards at the detention facility began treating her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Rose Mitchell was evolving from a disgraced officer awaiting court-martial into something far more dangerous to the conspiracy, a martyr whose persecution was awakening a sleeping giant within the military establishment. General Hawthorne recognized the shift and accelerated his timeline even further. Rose's court-martial was scheduled to begin within 48 hours, with a hand-picked panel of officers who could be trusted to deliver the verdict he needed. But he was discovering that controlling the narrative was becoming increasingly difficult as more evidence emerged and more witnesses came forward. The network that Thomas Mitchell had built was proving to be everything he'd hoped and more. It was resilient, adaptive, and utterly committed to exposing the truth regardless of the personal cost to its members. After 15 years of careful preparation, the dead were rising to seek justice for the living. The call to action had been answered, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse at Fort Harrison had never seen anything like it. By 6 a.m. on the morning of Rose's court-martial, over 200 vehicles had converged on the base, their occupants claiming various official purposes that somehow all required their presence at the legal proceedings. FBI agents flashed credentials and cited ongoing investigations. Congressional staffers arrived with subpoenas and document preservation orders. Military personnel from bases across the country appeared with transfer orders that had been processed through channels no one could quite trace. General Hawthorne stood at his office window, watching the controlled chaos unfold in the parking areas below, and realized that his carefully orchestrated plan to silence Rose Mitchell had become a circus that was attracting exactly the kind of attention he'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. Every additional witness made the conspiracy more vulnerable. Every new arrival increased the chances that something would go catastrophically wrong. The courtroom itself had been transformed from a routine, military legal proceeding into something resembling a congressional hearing. Media representatives sat in designated areas, their cameras focused on the defendant's table, where Rose would soon appear. Behind them, the gallery was packed with uniformed personnel whose presence seemed to radiate a palpable tension that made everyone uncomfortable. Colonel Patricia Sanders took her place as the presiding officer, with a growing sense of dread. She'd agreed to participate in this farce because she'd believed it would be a simple matter of railroading one troublesome officer through a predetermined outcome. Now she found herself at the center of a media spectacle that was being watched by people whose names appeared on congressional oversight committees and federal investigation units. The panel of officers who would determine Rose's fate filed in with the mechanical precision of men who understood that their every expression would be analyzed and scrutinized. Major Timothy Walsh, Colonel James Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Chun, Captain Michael Rodriguez, and Major Patricia Johnson had been chosen for their reliability and discretion. Now they sat under the scrutiny of cameras and observers, realizing that their careers would be defined by the decisions they made in the next few hours. Rose entered the courtroom wearing dress blues that had been returned to her for the proceedings, every ribbon and badge restored to its proper position. But the real statement was the posture she maintained: spine straight, shoulders square, eyes focused ahead with the unwavering confidence of someone who knew that truth was on her side. The tattoo beneath her uniform might have been hidden, but its significance radiated from her like an invisible force field. Jennifer Volkov took her place as defense counsel, her briefcase containing documents that could detonate like bombs if introduced as evidence. Across the aisle, the prosecution team, led by Major David Harrison, shuffled through their carefully prepared case, unaware that every piece of evidence they planned to present had been anticipated and countered. The proceedings began with Major Harrison's opening statement, a methodical presentation of the charges against Rose and the evidence that supposedly supported them. He spoke of classified documents found in her quarters, of unauthorized contacts with foreign nationals, of a pattern of behavior that demonstrated clear violations of military law and her oath as an officer. The defendant stands accused of betraying the trust placed in her by the United States Army, Harrison declared, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. The evidence will show that Lieutenant Mitchell deliberately and systematically compromised national security for reasons that remain unclear but whose consequences are undeniable. But as Harrison spoke, subtle disruptions began to occur throughout the courtroom. Cell phones buzzed with incoming messages. Laptops chimed with email notifications. Tablets displayed breaking news alerts that caused their readers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The carefully orchestrated legal proceeding was being undermined by real-time developments in the outside world. The first crack in the prosecution's case came when Major Harrison attempted to introduce the USB drive that had been found in Rose's quarters. As he held up the device and began describing its contents, a man in the gallery stood up and identified himself as FBI Special Agent Robert Morrison. "Your Honor," Agent Morrison announced, "that evidence is currently under federal investigation as part of an ongoing case involving fabricated intelligence and obstruction of justice. I have a court order requiring its preservation pending completion of our investigation." The stunned silence that followed was broken by Colonel Sanders' request for an immediate recess. As the courtroom erupted in confused murmurs, General Hawthorne felt his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around him. The evidence that was supposed to convict Rose was being confiscated by federal agents who somehow knew more about the case than the prosecutors did. During the recess, emergency conferences were held in private chambers as lawyers from multiple agencies argued over jurisdiction and evidence preservation. What had been planned as a routine military court-martial was rapidly evolving into a federal case with implications that reached far beyond a single officer's alleged misconduct. Proceedings resumed. Jennifer Volkov took the offensive with a motion that caught everyone off guard. She requested permission to present evidence relevant to her client's defense, specifically documentation related to Operation Black Swan and the circumstances surrounding Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell's death. Major Harrison objected immediately, citing classification levels and national security concerns. But Volkov was prepared for this response, producing federal court orders that had been signed by judges who outranked any military authority in the room. "Your Honor," Volkov stated, her voice carrying the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. "My client's alleged crimes are directly related to her investigation into criminal activities that resulted in her father's murder. The defense has a right to present evidence of the conspiracy that targeted both father and daughter." The gallery erupted as observers realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine court-martial. This was becoming an exposure of systematic corruption that had been hidden for 15 years. With Rose Mitchell as both victim and catalyst for its revelation, General Hawthorne made a desperate attempt to regain control by ordering the courtroom cleared of all non-essential personnel. But his authority was immediately challenged by federal agents who cited ongoing investigations, congressional staffers who claimed oversight responsibilities, and media representatives who invoked First Amendment protections. The general discovered that his power within his own command was being systematically undermined by people with higher authorities and broader jurisdictions. As Volkov began presenting her evidence, the scope of the conspiracy became clear to everyone in the courtroom. Financial records showed money flowing from defense contractors to offshore accounts controlled by military officers. Communication intercepts revealed discussions of weapon sales and operation cover-ups. Personnel files documented the systematic elimination of witnesses and the creation of false death records. The most damning evidence came from Thomas Mitchell's own files, preserved in the Swiss bank account that Rose's tattoo had unlocked. Video recordings showed General Hawthorne and Marcus Ventresses discussing the elimination of problems that included both father and daughter. Audio files captured planning sessions where the conspiracy discussed methods for discrediting military personnel who asked inconvenient questions. As each piece of evidence was presented, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew more electric. The panel of officers who were supposed to be judging Rose began to look like defendants themselves, their faces growing pale as they realized they were witnessing the exposure of crimes that reached to the highest levels of military command. Turning point came when Master Sergeant Daniel Krajewski was called as a witness. The man who was supposed to be dead walked into the courtroom with the confident stride of someone who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. His testimony was devastating, providing first-hand accounts of Operation Black Swan that contradicted every official report that had been filed. "We were told the weapons would be destroyed," Krajewski testified, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. "Instead, we watched them being loaded onto trucks owned by private contractors." When Staff Sergeant Mitchell asked questions about the discrepancies, he was told to mind his own business. When he persisted, he was transferred. When he continued investigating, he was killed. The prosecution's case collapsed entirely when Krajewski produced documentation that proved the USB drive found in Rose's quarters had been manufactured specifically for this operation. Serial numbers, manufacturing dates, and digital forensics all confirmed that the device had never been in Rose's possession before the day it was planted by conspirators who'd underestimated the network surveillance capabilities. As the truth emerged, General Hawthorne made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Rising from his seat in the gallery, he demanded that the proceedings be halted on national security grounds, claiming that classified information was being exposed that could damage ongoing operations. But his intervention was met by a voice That silenced the entire courtroom. Rose Mitchell stood at the defendant's table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger. "General Hawthorne," she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade, "you've spent 15 years hiding behind national security classifications to cover up your crimes. You've murdered American soldiers, betrayed your oath, and corrupted everything the uniform is supposed to represent. The only thing you're protecting now is your own guilt." The confrontation between Rose and the general who'd tried to destroy her was electric, with 15 years of suppressed truth. Every eye in the courtroom was focused on these two figures, the young officer who'd refused to be silenced and the senior commander, whose career had been built on lies and betrayal. General Hawthorne's face flushed with rage as he realized that his authority was meaningless in this transformed environment. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Lieutenant. There are forces at work here that are bigger than your personal grievances." Rose's response was delivered with the cold precision of someone who'd studied her enemy for years. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, General. A conspiracy of cowards who used American soldiers as cover for private profit. Men who sent others to die while they counted money in Swiss bank accounts. The only force at work here is justice, and it's been a long time coming." The confrontation ended when federal agents moved to arrest General Hawthorne on charges that had been unsealed minutes earlier. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the man who'd ordered Rose's humiliation found himself being led away in disgrace while cameras captured every moment. The courtroom erupted in chaos as other arrest warrants were executed simultaneously. Marcus Ventresses was taken into custody at his corporate headquarters. Congressman Hutchinson was arrested in his Capitol Hill office. Deputy Director Vail was apprehended at CIA headquarters in Langley. The conspiracy that had operated for 15 years was being dismantled in real time. Colonel Sanders gavelled for order, but the proceedings had moved far beyond her control. What had begun as Rose's court-martial had become the exposure of a criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of government and military leadership. As federal agents secured the courtroom and began collecting evidence, Rose found herself surrounded by the members of her father's unit who'd emerged from the shadows to support her. These men who'd been declared dead were very much alive, and their presence represented the ultimate vindication of Thomas Mitchell's sacrifice. Final confrontation was over, but its consequences would reverberate for years to come. The conspiracy that had seemed untouchable was crumbling, and the truth that had been buried for 15 years was finally seeing the light of day. Justice had been a long time coming, but it had arrived with the force of a hurricane, sweeping away lies and corruption that had festered in darkness for far too long. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation that shattered the conspiracy, Rose Mitchell stood before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., watching the sunrise paint the reflecting pool in shades of gold and crimson. The marble figure of the great emancipator gazed down at her with eternal patience, a reminder that justice sometimes takes generations to achieve but arrives with the force of inevitability when its time has come. She wore civilian clothes now, a simple black suit that made her look more like a government attorney than a former military officer. The transformation wasn't just sartorial. Rose had discovered a new purpose that extended far beyond the uniform she'd worn with such pride. The tattoo on her back remained, but its meaning had evolved from a secret map to a public symbol of resistance against corruption and abuse of power. The aftermath of Operation Black Swan's exposure had been swift and comprehensive. Federal prosecutors had filed charges against 47 individuals, including 3 generals, 2 admirals, a deputy director of the CIA, 5 members of Congress, and executives from a dozen defense contractors. The trials were expected to last for years, but the preliminary hearings had already revealed a level of systemic corruption that shocked even seasoned investigators. General William Hawthorne had been the first to break under pressure, providing detailed testimony about the conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession had opened floodgates of information that led to additional arrests and the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen funds. The man who'd once commanded the respect of thousands of soldiers was spending his remaining years in federal prison, his legacy forever tainted by greed and betrayal. Marcus Ventris faced charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. His company, Ventris Strategic Solutions, had been dissolved and its assets seized to pay restitution to the families of soldiers who died protecting operations designed to enrich private contractors rather than serve national interests. The corporate empire he'd built through corruption had crumbled in a matter of weeks. Congressman Bradley Hutchinson had resigned from office and pleaded guilty to charges that included bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His political career was over, his reputation destroyed, his comfortable retirement replaced by the prospect of decades behind bars. The House Ethics Committee had launched a broader investigation into defense contractor influence that was expected to implicate dozens of other legislators. But the most significant changes were happening within the military itself. The exposure of Operation Black Swan had triggered a comprehensive review of special operations procedures, financial oversight, and command accountability. New protocols were being implemented to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under the old system. Colonel Patricia Sanders had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Her testimony had provided crucial insights into how the conspiracy had operated and how similar schemes might be prevented in the future. She'd accepted early retirement from the Army and was now working as a consultant, helping to implement the reforms her testimony had made necessary. The 12 members of Thomas Mitchell's unit had been officially restored to life with full honors and benefits. Their families had been compensated for years of hardship endured while living under false identities. Several had chosen to rejoin the military in advisory roles, helping to train a new generation of special operations personnel in ethical conduct and accountability. Master Sergeant Daniel Krajewski had been promoted to sergeant major and assigned to the Pentagon, where he was developing new protocols for financial oversight of covert operations. His experience with both sides of the system, as a participant in legitimate missions and as a witness to their corruption, made him uniquely qualified to design safeguards that could prevent future abuses. Jennifer Volkov had left her cover identity behind and returned to her real name and rank as Major Elena Volkov. Her intelligence background and legal expertise had made her invaluable in the ongoing investigations, and she'd been assigned to a joint task force responsible for identifying and dismantling other corruption networks within the defense establishment. But perhaps the most important changes were happening at the policy level. Congress had passed the Thomas Mitchell Accountability Act, a comprehensive reform package that required enhanced financial reporting for all military contractors, independent oversight of special operations funding, and whistleblower protections. For military personnel who reported suspicious activities, the legislation also established the Mitchell Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the families of military personnel who'd been harmed by corruption or abuse within the defense establishment. Rose had been asked to serve as the Foundation's first director, a position that allowed her to continue her father's work while helping others who'd faced similar challenges. The Foundation's headquarters were located in a renovated building near Arlington National Cemetery, its walls lined with photographs of service members who'd paid the ultimate price for their integrity. Thomas Mitchell's portrait occupied a place of honor, surrounded by images of the men and women whose courage had made the Foundation's work possible. Rose's new role required her to travel extensively, meeting with military families, investigating reports of misconduct, and advocating for policy changes that would protect future generations of service members. It was demanding work, but it provided her with a sense of purpose that military service alone had never offered. The international implications of Operation Black Swan's exposure were still unfolding. Weapons that had been illegally sold through the conspiracy had been tracked to conflict zones around the world, leading to diplomatic complications and additional criminal investigations. Several allied governments were conducting their own reviews of defense relationships with American contractors, leading to new international protocols for arms, sales, and military cooperation. The Swiss bank accounts that Thomas Mitchell had used to preserve evidence had yielded additional intelligence about other criminal enterprises operating within the defense establishment. Financial investigators were still analyzing the data, but preliminary findings suggested that Operation Black Swan was just one tentacle of a much larger network of corruption that extended across multiple agencies and time periods. Rose found herself at the center of ongoing media attention that she handled with characteristic grace and determination. Interviews on major news programs, congressional testimony, and speaking engagements at military academies had made her a public figure whose story inspired others to speak out against corruption and abuse of power. But she was careful to share credit for the victory with the network her father had built. Every public appearance included recognition of the men and women who'd risked everything to expose the truth. The 12 dead soldiers who'd returned to life became symbols of resurrection and redemption, proof that honor could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The tattoo on Rose's back had become famous in its own right, featured in news articles and documentary films about the case. Medical experts had marveled at Thomas Mitchell's ingenuity in encoding so much information in what appeared to be decorative artwork. Cryptographers had studied the design as an example of innovative data storage techniques. Artists had celebrated it as a masterpiece of functional beauty, but for Rose, the tattoo remained what it had always been, a connection to her father and a reminder of the principles he'd died defending. She'd considered having additional work done to commemorate the victory they'd achieved, but decided that the original design was perfect as it stood. Some legacies didn't need improvement, only preservation. The personal cost of her journey had been significant. Her military career was over. Her relationships with former colleagues were complicated by the revelations about widespread corruption, and her sense of trust in institutions had been permanently altered. But these losses were balanced by gains that were immeasurable. She discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a capacity for leadership that extended beyond military command structures. The network her father had built had become a family that provided support and understanding that conventional relationships couldn't match. Most importantly, she'd found a way to honor his memory while building something new and positive from the wreckage of his death. The Foundation's work was expanding rapidly as more cases of military corruption came to light. Rose had hired a staff of investigators, lawyers, and advocates who shared her commitment to accountability and justice. Their work was difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it was making a real difference in the lives of military families who'd been harmed by systemic abuse. One of the Foundation's first major cases involved a Navy procurement scandal that had resulted in the deaths of sailors who'd been given defective equipment. The investigation had revealed a pattern of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that mirrored the financial motivations behind Operation Black Swan. The successful resolution of the case had led to design changes that would protect future generations of naval personnel. Another case had exposed a practice of inflating casualty reports to justify increased funding for veterans programs, with the excess money being diverted to private accounts. The investigation had been complex and politically sensitive, but the Foundation's work had resulted in the recovery of millions of dollars that were redirected to legitimate veteran services. As Rose stood before the Lincoln Memorial, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment, she felt the presence of everyone who'd made the victory possible. Her father's spirit seemed to hover nearby, finally at peace knowing that his sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. The 12 soldiers who'd given up their identities to preserve the truth stood with her in solidarity. The network of allies who'd risked everything to expose corruption surrounded her with invisible support. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the memorial steps where so many historic moments had unfolded. Rose thought about the future, about the work that still needed to be done, about the young military officers who would face their own tests of conscience in the years to come. The system wasn't perfect. No human institution ever could be, but it was better than it had been. The checks and balances that Thomas Mitchell had died trying to preserve were functioning again. The accountability that had been systematically undermined was being restored. The honor that had been corrupted by greed and ambition was being reclaimed by people who understood its true value. Rose smiled as she remembered her father's words from that last conversation at Fort Bragg. The military makes you tough, but it's your heart that makes you a soldier worth following. She'd learned that leadership wasn't about rank or authority. It was about courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was everything you'd worked to achieve. The tattoo on her back no longer burned with the fire of hidden secrets. Instead, it warmed her with the knowledge that some legacies truly do refuse to die. That truth has a power that corruption can never fully suppress, and that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they're willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. As she walked down the memorial steps toward her waiting car, Rose Mitchell carried with her the satisfaction of a mission completed and the anticipation of battles yet to be fought. The conspiracy that had killed her father was destroyed, but the work of preventing future conspiracies would continue for as long as people were willing to choose power over principle. The wolf on her spine had found its pack, and together, they would stand guard against the darkness that forever threatens the light of justice and truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.